Hi, my name is Major General Marc Overton. I'm the Assistant Chief of Defence Staff Reserves and Cadets in the UK Defence. It's great to be here this morning. Sorry I can't be there in person. Great to be able to talk to you, and also I hope my good friend Major General Doug Laidlaw is in the audience. It was good to see you in Athens last month. If I had the first slide, please. I just want to quickly talk about why reserves are increasingly important in UK defence and indeed in defence per se. You know, Ukraine has highlighted that without reserves they probably wouldn't exist in terms of mobilisation at pace and scale, in terms of sustaining the fight. And there's lessons in terms of how they've done that, whether it's distributed mobilisation, hybrid mobilisation, whether they've sort of really embraced the use of civilian skills at pace and scale. The other side of the coin is the Russians have hollowed out their forces, and a lot of their regular cadre that was due to train the second echelon, the third echelon, the reserves, was in the first echelon, and therefore struggled to get to the fight and create the right conditions to use and train the reservists they had properly. So there's some lessons, positive lessons in terms of the use and utilisation of reserves, especially coming from Ukraine, and some negative lessons that I think we should all learn from. And what for me is really focusing minds is, to sustain a conflict. Ukraine's been going on for over a year now. You need that second, third, fourth echelon follow-on forces. The whole concept of mass and reinforcement, regeneration is now a thing, certainly in Western Europe. And the other thing that's really powerful is the use of civilian skills, specialist skills, whether that's drone pilots who were software engineers, whether it's strategic logistics specialists who were running Amazon type operations before the war. It's absolutely clear that specialist civilian skills are helping innovate the character of conflict, changing the character of conflict. And the use of civilians in those in that is absolutely battle winning. So the key headline from Ukraine is that reserves are essential both on and off the battlefield. So lots of lessons. If I move to the next slide, one of the things that we're doing, and again with your help, and thank you for that, is force generating the training for those going to Ukraine who are civilians, and turning them in 5 weeks into people who can survive and operate on the front line of Ukraine. Op-Interflex is a major focus for us here in the UK. It's a major part of how we're supporting NATO and its support to Ukraine. It's not just about training the individual soldiers, it's also about training the commanders as well. And we are doing this at scale, and significant numbers involved in that. What's also really interesting, if you go to the next slide, is that this is a combat infantryman's course, reserve combat infantryman's course, essentially. It's over 5 weeks, and it is literally taking a civilian from the street to the front line, 35 days of training, half of which is in field, and 10 days of which is live firing. And what we're also learning, or relearning, is some of these are core skills that we're training for, which are relevant in all operations. And certainly in the UK, we've become, since Afghanistan, quite risk averse. The training pipelines have been extended. So it's an opportunity for us to look at how do we train our reservists, what are the right ways to train our reservists. And so one of the things that we're trying to reduce in the Army, British Army, is the concept of equivalence. So trying not to do everything the regular does, and therefore making the training process significantly stretched and the attrition rates very high. Looking at what we can do with the Ukrainians in 5 weeks, what are the lessons that we can take from that, and how do we speed up our training? What do we do remotely? What do we need to do face to face? Also some of the basic skills. Whether it's navigation, fitness, first aid, communication, shooting. These are basic soldiering skills that we're really focusing in on, and I think there's lots of goodness in there that we can learn in how we train our reserves. Next slide, please. So the UK Defence's reserve split across a number of categories, and really what we're focusing on in terms of how we structure ourselves is looking at the strategic reserve much more as a thing. It's fallen into abeyance. These are the people who did serve, regular reservists and regular and reserve, who have retired, who have left the service. How do we access their skills? How do we continue to have them connected to defence? So that when needed we can call on them, but also if they have skills that we can access or they're interested in re-engaging, it's not as painful as it currently is. And I think you in Australia have certainly, under your SOARCIN model, got after that, and that sort of spectrum of service piece is absolutely front and centre to what we're talking about. We have something called full-time reserve service, FTRS, which we're looking at reforming. It's that conduit between reserve service and regular service. We see reservists tuning up to do it more commitment and having a contracted commitment of 3-5 days a week. We also see regulars looking to reduce their commitment and for family and personal reasons. So it's that grey space between regular volunteer service and reserve service that we are looking to get better at and have it more porous up and down, so reservists can tune up their commitments and regulars can tune down their commitment. We're also quite seized on the sponsored reserve. We do this for some niche skills with industries like tank transporter skills. Increasingly starting to look at it on other areas, whether it's maintaining airframes or cyber and digital skills. But how do we, especially in those pinch point trades where industry are going to be part of how we operate in an operational environment, how do we leverage those skills and what sort of models are right for that? So looking at that spectrum, strategic, which is a latent reserve, part-time volunteer reserve, the people who hold down civilian jobs and do this in their spare time, then the contracted element, which is very much on a 3 to 5 day, depending on what their requirements are, and then the fully committed regular / mobilised reserve or mobilised service, and having a view across that spectrum and the ability to tune up and down and designing our systems for terms and conditions of service to enable that to happen. We're very much looking at what you've been doing in the Australian Force, Defence Force. We're quite keen to replicate a lot of that. But that is an enabler, I think, for a better understanding and utilisation of reserve service, because at the moment we're very stovepiped into reserve, FTRS and regular buckets. Next slide, please. So to give you an idea of the UK Reserve Forces, about 40,000 in total. The main one from a mass perspective is the Army, as you would expect, and we have that down at unit level. And they're committed to first, second echelon forces, and at different stages of readiness, right across the full mix of combat support and combat service support. The Navy and Air Force are smaller and more of an auxiliary, focusing on those specialist skills, which is probably more in line with their sort of platform-centric operating model. Next slide, please. So start with the Senior Service, the Royal Naval Reserve and the Royal Marine Reserve. Very much embedded in the operation. They have bases which they soldier or serve out of. But what is they're very much deployed where possible on ship, on tasks, and trained as individuals to fulfil those roles in the maritime environment. We do use reservists for some of the specialist civilian skills, in particular in digital and media. But largely it's about workforce auxiliary and workforce support to certain trade groups. Royal Marine Reserve are very much looking at two particular roles in terms of their roles, force protection and maritime security, as part of the commando force. Next slide, please. Army Reserve is very much that mass across a whole portfolio of units, but also covering the whole of the UK. So that they are the most prominent, most visible, and they have that sort of firm-based responsibilities. So get involved more overtly in the sort of military aid to the civil community type of operations, because they have that sort of local footprint. The time commitment is between 19 to 27 days a year, but a lot more, do about 40 to 50 days, and then some who do up to 100 and beyond. But this is very much doing it alongside a civilian career. And it's also about providing that reinforcement in the second echelon. The Chief of the General Staff, the head of the Army, has very much carved out, mentioned it in the Land Warfare Conference about 6 weeks ago, carved out a second echelon as the area of focus for the reserves. Next slide, please. And the Royal Air Force Reserves very much focusing around the key bases, but also in terms of that support to the RAF bases, but also specialist skills, be it cyber, be it medic, and increasingly sort of helping with some of the new capabilities like space. So actually growing to about 3,500. This is again more of an auxiliary force and quite similar in many ways to the Maritime Reserve. As I said, the Army focusing more on mass and formed units. Next slide, please. One of the key things, which I'm sure you're very aware in the Australian reserves, is employer engagement. I spend a lot of my time in talking to employers, understanding how we can work together at a defence level. And employers allow our reservists to serve. This reserve service invariably doesn't pay the mortgage, and we have careers alongside it. I, for example, work in technology. I run a region, Northern Europe, for a global software company, which employs in my region about 1,700 people. So, I need to be able to do this role alongside what I do in Civvy Street. To recognise that and to have a conversation, a proper conversation, not just tell the employer what we're doing with their reservist. We've created the Armed Forces Covenant, which is basically the Bronze Award. And then once they've signed that and they've acknowledged support to the Armed Forces community, we move up the tiers of a Silver Award and a Gold Award. We're actually just kicking off the award ceremonies later part of this year. It's been hugely successful. We've got about 10,000 Armed Forces Covenant signing and over a couple of thousand awards. And the difference between the various awards is really levels of commitment and advocacy. To go up to a Gold Award, you need to offer your reservists 10 days paid leave a year. And as you can imagine, the employers are quite seized on having veterans and ex-service personnel in their organisations. That's really positive. It's discipline, it's skills, it's behaviours that they want in their organisation. But actually, the more challenging group is those reservists who have to balance their reserve service with their full-time employment. And that's where the group that needs the most help. So that's really what we're focusing here on. And it's allowing us we have a Gold Alumni Association that's a real force for good, a community of or a cohort of employers that we can talk to about how we do reserve service and some of the policy changes that we're looking to bring in and bringing them with us as a supportive a group of employers. So really important. Next slide, please. So what I'm really keen on as we move from an integrated review into an integrated review refresh, and now we've just published a Defence Command Plan refresh, which is going to go into a defence strategy, is having a much more expansive discussion around reserves, based on Ukraine in particular, but also based on the fact that the ideas of a large standing force that's separate to the industry is less relevant than it was. We need to innovate. We need connections into industry. We need to work in partnership with industry. We need to generate a pace and scale, and therefore, having a strong reserve is absolutely front and centre to the UK defence, but also from what I'm seeing across our NATO allies. To help enable that, a better understanding of the opportunities and the commitment levels, that spectrum of service, absolutely front and centre to help enable that. We're looking at a single legislative act that helps in that porosity, that flexibility between regular and reserve service. Right now we have two acts, a Reserve Forces Act and a Armed Forces Act, regular and reserve separate. So what are the right touch points? How does that work going forward as we are increasingly more a whole force and a single spectrum of service? Linked to that, a total reward approach and incentivization based on what the individual service personnel is facing, so really down to the specific role level. And to help enable all of this, a much better digital interface. We have it for our pay, we have it for availability, increasingly we need it for opportunities, job opportunities, and using those digital platforms to reduce the friction and increasing the opportunity for our service personnel, I think is an absolute given. It's also a real opportunity for Defence to have a better understanding of the skills it has in its reserve community, and having access to those civilian skills is just essential. I'm an infantry officer, but actually I'm a digital expert. So how do I offer those skills to Defence? How do we know, to do that? Having those really more insightful and detailed discussions about skills that we have in the reserves can only help us improve our awareness and Defence's understanding of what it has in its workforce. And I think that's absolutely fundamental. And then really getting after that career management piece and the opportunities that are enabled, and using the Australian model, I think is a great example of and I'd love to learn more about it, about how you've simplified your terms and conditions of service and you're enabling those opportunities more visibly. One thing that I'm particularly seized on is the time it takes to move up and down certain employment groups. You do it in a matter of 30 days. Ours takes a lot longer, and therefore there's friction in the machine. So that's what we're doing in terms of the key change programs, and really embedding those in those Defence level change programs. This is not reserve stuff, this is Defence whole force stuff. So whether it's spectrum of service or digitisation, another big area is National Defence Plan, looking at how we protect ourselves. Again, that's a reserve activity mainly. So how do we leverage these big strategic change programs to improve the life of our reservists? Huge opportunity. Next slide, please. So the operation and program that we put together a couple of years ago, Reserve Forces 30, we're continuing to build on, we're refreshing it, and focusing on a number of areas, as I've mentioned. The one area on those specialist skills, we've kicked off a specialist reserve study, pushing it out to the frontline commands and saying, which skills do you find difficult to train and retain in the regular force? How do we build and identify and build those capability groups where reservists' civilian skills and experience can really help amplify it, whether it's space, it's obviously medical, it's digital, it's cyber, strategic logistics. There are areas which are just really tough, because they are tough in industry to recruit those skills and keep them current. How do we get after that? So specialist skills, big focus. Spectrum of service, digital in the people space, as I mentioned. And then the whole sort of National Defence Plan, strategic reserve. How big do we need our reserve to be? How do we generate resilience in our structures? How do we generate second and third echelon forces? And then around that, what's the right mobilisation policy? How do we get that mobilisation culture back into the way we do business? Do we know where our serving and ex-serving personnel are? How do we contact them? How do we use digital platforms to do that? How do we engage with our employers? So this is a Defence, service change program that's supporting the change programs of the single services. Next slide, please. So we're developing across the spectrum of operations. The main thing, and sort of calling, if you like, call to arms, is really around war fighting. That's what Ukraine has shown us. The core focus and purpose of the reserve is war fighting. Now, on the back of that, we provide specialist skills. On the back of that, we provide resilience to their structures. On the back of that, we provide resilience for national defence. I absolutely get all that, but the focus and the reason that people join is that war-fighting ethos and spirit, and therefore that's the defining call to arms. And I think being clear on that purpose and your role in that is critical. Next slide, please. I mentioned the sort of skills that we're looking at, the specialist skills. So really the specialist study focusing on these areas and working out what the demand signal is. What are the strategic workforce plans in these areas, these pinch point trades? How do we work? What's the organizational construct? My belief is that we're civilian skills. This is what we do in our civilian life. Therefore, we're probably not best placed to build and operate it in defence because we're running our own civilian careers. But we can certainly advise. We can shape. We can strategize. We can red team. We can absolutely support. And therefore, what are the right roles for our specialist skills, and what's the right mandate to help really bring this to life in defence, and not risk over-promising and under-delivering, but really provide that systemic and significant support to these specialist skill areas. And I think a great one for that is medic. We've been doing that for years. It's become just part of what we do. The medical teams are largely reservist. That's fine. How do we take some of those lessons and replicate it? Next slide, please. So my priorities as the Assistant Chief of the Defence Staff are really, firstly, acting as that single voice across the defence. Similar to General Laidlaw, this, it's not in the DNA of the regular force. And that's no surprise, no criticism, it's just not. They haven't lived the life of doing this alongside a civilian job. And all the challenges that we face in doing that. So, acting as that reserve conscience, getting it on the agenda, getting it into the strategy, getting those hooks into the key change programs. Digitisation, absolutely essential. We have a remote hybrid workforce. How do we talk to them? How do they get to know the opportunities? A lot of our reservists never get out of their local subunit. A lot of our talent sits in the subunits. How do we really enhance that and give them the opportunities and really bring in those skills into the wider defence organisation? The spectrum of services, I think, is a key enabler for us to have a different discussion about reserve service. I'm increasingly seeing regulars who want to tune down their commitments. The minute they stop being 100% committed regular, they become a reservist. They have other commitments, in particular civilian work commitments. And that means they sort of become part of our tribe. And having a more expansive view of them, as well as those who have left service, I think gives more muscle and power to our organisation. So 40,000 today, we should be aiming at over 100,000 when you include the specialist and the wider definition of the reserve. Strategic reserve, really important to get after those latents, those ex-service personnel, but also to allow them to tune back up and serve if they wish to. But those pinch point skills, not just, we talked a lot about civilian skills, but those military pinch point skills, nuclear engineers, for example, on submarines, these huge amount of investment. How do we keep tabs on them, and how can they make our structures more resilient? And then those specialist reserve capabilities. What are they? What readiness? Where are they needed? A lot of them are on the strategic space. How do we best utilise them? How do we best organise? How do we get demand signals to them? How do we leverage those civilian skills at pace? And we're seeing the whole battle space, as I said, in Ukraine changing based on a lot of the software skills that games developers in Ukraine had. Whether that's taking a drone, a sat phone, a laptop, and an app, and just changing the way we do target acquisition and for our weapon systems. Fundamentally, this is civ tech meets defence, and how do we really do that in a more industrial way? And then the final thing, we talk about employers, we talk about service. The third leg of the stool, and the people that allow you to serve, are your families. We do this in our leisure time. And therefore, the bit that gets squeezed is family time. And it's really important we acknowledge that. It's difficult to do. Not all families are interested, but this is no longer a hobby. This is no longer something that mum or dad does at a weekend. This is a part-time responsibility that needs to be acknowledged. There are benefits about being part of the service family. The regulars do that. That's part of what they sign up to in the UK in particular. How do we bring that to life for the reserve service family? How do we make more of that? How do we communicate those benefits? How do we make them feel part of the community? In my experience, the reason people leave reserve service is not to do with work. You can always change your work. You can't easily change your family. And that's the pressure that we put by asking our reservists to do more, is on the family. So how do we acknowledge that? Love to understand and work with yourselves on that, because I think that's something that we need to shine more of a light on. But look, I'm just really keen to sort of help articulate what we're up to in the UK. We are working very closely with yourselves, especially at the NATO Reserve Forces Committee. I thank you for that. I thank you for your support. And we are hosting the next NATO Reserve Forces Committee in next July at Sandhurst in the UK, and I look forward to continuing to work with you as we become an increasingly important part of our respective defence. Thank you very much.